We are going to leave the halls of political power for a moment to talk about another type of power, cultural power. This week, writer Hal Niedzwiecki touched off a pretty combustible debate over cultural appropriation in this country. He wrote the following in an editorial that opened an issue of Right magazine that was, in this case, devoted to Indigenous literature. He writes, "I don't believe in cultural appropriation. In my opinion, anyone, anywhere should be encouraged to imagine other peoples, other cultures, other identities. I'd go so far as to say that there should even be an award for doing so, the Appropriation Prize for Best Book by an author who writes about people who aren't even remotely like her or him." Well, that prompted outrage from both Indigenous and non-Indigenous writers and artists. The column was called insensitive, tone-deaf, even racist. Niedzwiecki apologized and he resigned from his post as editor of the magazine. But the debate didn't end there. Several of the most prominent journalists in Canada are under fire from the Indigenous community and beyond for their reaction to the controversial editorial and what happened in its aftermath. Some tweeted their support for #appropriate prize and even went so far as to donate money to start an appropriation prize fund, including, it must be said, CBC's executive Steve Latorante. And several of them, including Steve Latorante, have since apologized. We're going to get the Scrum to weigh in. John, Susan, and Denise are back with me from Ottawa. John, you're an author. Susan, I know you're an author as well, but John, I'll start with you. Were the journalists right to perceive this reaction as an attack on free speech?
Oh, the journalists violated what ought to be one of the cardinal rules of modern times, which is if you're on Twitter, don't tweet late at night. If you think you have something that's clever and provocative to say, and maybe you've had a couple of drinks at that point, what you say could be clever and provocative and career-limiting as well. So just don't say it. Look, cultural appropriation is universal. Without cultural appropriation, we wouldn't have rock and roll, as people have already pointed out. Secondly, as a writer, what you write works or it doesn't work. It's the one and only criteria for writing. That works, that didn't work, and that's all that matters. As for the writers who wanted to create this cultural appropriation prize, they were, I think, universally older and white and affluent in positions of power. And I'm sorry, I will not come to the defense of people who, like me, are older and white and affluent in positions of power. They don't need defending. They've got plenty of resources on their own.
Okay. Denise.
Well, for me, it's multi-layered, and at the risk of sounding pedantic here, but in terms of looking at the word culture and what that means, it's actually, and I think about Indigenous communities, I think about Afro-Nova Scotian communities, Black communities, and in fact even French Canadians, right? That it is at your core. So this idea that somehow someone who has not had your lived experience can write about it, get accolades, and then on top of that, get a prize for that. And I think that's why there was the outrage. And in my view, you know, an appropriation prize, what does that mean? You know, let's have a colonization prize, some would argue, in terms of what has been done to largely marginalized communities. So it's a really, really difficult conversation to have because you want to learn about other communities. Your next door neighbor may not have had the same experiences as you, or, you know, the person down the street. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that you can then essentially, you know, wear their shoes on every day and then presume to actually be in a position to talk freely about what they experience. So, yeah.
Susan?
Well, I think the problem rests in two different notions of appropriation. So the mainstream white notion of appropriation is, you know, when people say, oh, you're appropriate, you know, is that you...
Oh, I can provide you with the definition. Here is the official definition of appropriation. Let's take a look at that. The action of taking something for one's own use, typically without the owner's permission. There it is.
So Joseph Boyden being a recent case in point. So some people see that as a policing of the imagination, and I think John's absolutely right that, you know, that you can write empathetically and knowledgeably about another gender, another race. Many people do it all the time. I don't think that's what the critics see as appropriation. The word cultural appropriation, especially to Indigenous people, essentially describes their history. I mean, they've had their land taken away, their language, their culture. They still face discrimination in a lot of ways. So appropriation for them is a far larger and more damaging notion. And I think that's why the reaction was so angry and so deep and deeply felt. And I was struck by your interview the other day with Jonathan Kay and Jesse Wente, who's an Ojibwe man. And he made the point that, yes, there have been an abundance of apologies, because I think a lot of people just a lot of white privileged people just reacted impulsively and from their definition of appropriation. Anyway, he said, Jesse Wade, he said, you know, apologies are not enough. We really need change now. We moved past apology to change. That resonated with me. I found the whole thing, I was kind of a dazed onlooker for a lot of it.
What do you mean a dazed onlooker?
I didn't know who to believe. I didn't know which side was right. I really didn't. But I've learned and listened over the controversy, and I now get his point. I think I really get his point.
Let me play devil's advocate. Go ahead, Denise.
That's the key. That's the learning and the listening component. And look, we saw what happened with Nikki Ashton several
to the
months
left.
ago.
She took
right?
Beyonce's
with
to the
tweet.
left. Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, to the left, and it was like, oh, it's Beyonce and Black Lives Matter. Toronto went after her, and she learned and she listened and she had, you know, there was that exchange.
There was Amanda Piel, also the artist who was painting in the same style as another famous Indigenous artist.
Yeah, and we see these things, and I think the conversation around appropriation really needs to go to the learning component. So we want, you know, as much as you want to try to express, where in many cases, whether it's in literature, politics, art, music, where the dominant and quite frankly, the white mainstream is the one that has center stage, where you have artists in these classes who are trying to express themselves, and then someone comes along. So I think that's where the argument is.
Okay, but
that there's not enough space.
Can I just jump in here? And Denise, I'll put this to you first, based on what you just said. Isn't it good we live in a society where so many people and journalists in this country jumped headlong into a situation where they believed freedom of speech was threatened?
Freedom of speech is one thing, but when you are putting speech in the mouths of others is a very different thing. Yeah. So I think it's a slippery slope. I completely agree in terms of, you know, how can we, you know, whether it's report stories or talk about others' experiences, but in the absence of those voices from those communities sharing it's very difficult for folks from marginalized communities to understand why you would have, you know, the best prize for appropriating a culture. It's really tough.
And let's not forget that notwithstanding breakthroughs and a new vitality in Indigenous writing, the fact that a guy from Yemen, Kamal al-Saleh, won the Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for political reporting this week. I mean, there are individual success stories among non-white population writers, but the brutal fact remains that to be a writer in this country is to live a marginal existence, and I would say more so if you're not part of the white mainstream.
Yeah, that's exactly the point that I was going to make. For all of those who were tweeting their outrage and their defense of free speech and their right of artists to culturally appropriate, which indeed I would defend that right. I remember when I was a university student, we were arguing whether D.H. Lawrence had any right to write about women. Either it works or it doesn't work. But for those writers who are at the absolute top of the pyramid, making very good salaries and secure jobs, tweeting their outrage. Remember what it was like when you were starting out. Remember how incredibly hard it is to get a start in the business as a writer. And imagine just for a minute how much harder it must be if you are Indigenous or you are a person of color and you're trying to break in. It's tough, and a little bit of empathy here on all sides wouldn't be amiss.